Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Schorn. 63 years and 1 week ago, 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty was murdered, daughter of Frank and Dorothy Dougherty and sister to Kay Dougherty, now Kay Talanka, was murdered in the choir loft of St. Mark's Church, her home parish, where she attended school in Bristol Borough, Bucks County. We know Carol Ann was raped and asphyxiated. She took her final breath in that choir loft of the church that was so sacred to her and to her family. This case went unsolved for 63 years and 1 day. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office sought and obtained permission from our Board of Judges to submit an investigation into the Bucks County investigating grand jury. And I need to speak briefly about the grand jury. They are random citizens from this county selected to serve, and they serve 1 day a week for up to 2 years handling unsolved cases. They serve with anonymity. No one will know the service they've given to this county, but we know what it meant to allow us to submit this case. And I need to speak of the team that handled this case at this point in time. My colleague and I, Christopher Reese, to my right, was Chief Deputy District Attorney, Chief of Prosecution, were the prosecutors who submitted this case, but I need to emphasize the team of investigators that handled this case. And collectively, these investigators spent 20 years of their lives, professional lives, committed to pursuing the truth and justice for Carol Ann and her family. And that is Trooper Christopher Cleveland, to my right, from the Pennsylvania State Police, Trooper David Baer of the Pennsylvania State Police, Trooper Jordan Rhodes of the Pennsylvania State Police, and my colleague, Lieutenant Timothy Perkins of the Bucks County District Attorney's Office. But it didn't just happen with this present team. I need to emphasize, and actually, if you could please come up here, my colleague and stand with our team, Megan Hunziker, who runs our grand jury. She's the attorney who administrates our grand jury, which is something near and dear to me, something I did for many decades, and happy to pass the torch, and her colleague, Andrew Bukowski, who's not here. But I also need to mention our support staff. You don't understand that our support staff is so critical in helping us accomplish this. We have 2 members I'm looking right at behind us on the other side of these cameras who were instrumental. My office manager and the support staff member who runs our grand jury from a staff standpoint. My office manager, my assistant, who deals with all of my daily needs, literally scanned thousands of pages so that this team had one central report to work from. And then our grand jury support staff that administrates our grand jury makes it possible to do what we do best. But I cannot fail to mention every single investigator that handled this case from the inception of this case did their part. And Kay's going to speak to that, Chief Faragelli, and how much he meant to her family. But every single one, and although the case went unsolved for so many decades, that was not through lack of effort or dedication or commitment to pursuing the truth. You can't even imagine the challenges that a case like this poses, which is so incredibly rare. We believe it may be the only rape and murder of a little girl in a church in the United States. Not to mention the fact that this truly was events that you could not script, presented such challenges, the perfect storm, in that there were at least 3 other initially credible suspects to this case. And no doubt, those facts impeded and thwarted the investigation through no fault of those investigators. But I cannot fail to recognize the Pennsylvania State Police, and a number of the command staff is here, and it's my privilege to have them here, and Captain Kelly will speak. For the years that followed, so Bristol Borough Police, and I have to commend them, I already did by mentioning Chief Faragelli, but every person who worked in that department that worked this case did their part, and Chief Moores is here and he'll speak as well. But the Pennsylvania State Police joined that investigation immediately following Carol Ann's murder, and they had allocated resources for the decades that followed, scrutinizing every physical piece of evidence with the hope that there would be a forensic break, with the hope that the developments in forensic science would allow for some breakthrough in this case. Although by and large that is not the case with our findings, I will touch upon there is a forensic aspect to our findings and conclusions. The work that was done to keep this alive was nothing short of remarkable. And forgive me for taking a moment. I can't fail to mention all of you. And Kay is going to mention two of you in particular, the members of the media. And I think for two of you, it was personal. It wasn't just your professional obligation. You were motivated to make sure this case stayed alive, knowing that doing so, one, could provide new leads, and two, continue to reinforce the work we do, that we never forget our unsolved cases. So I thank all of you for that, and I thank you for being here today. And now to our findings, and it's going to be lengthy, forgive me. Typically, you have a summary of our case, and it's really just an opportunity to answer the questions and cover it in broad strokes. So be patient with me as I summarize, and I'll certainly answer any questions. We're all here to answer any questions you may have. We know with specificity that Carol Ann went to school at St. Mark's, 5th grader, 9 years old. She went there like any other normal Monday in the fall. And she came home with plans to meet her friends at the library. She had 2 books she wanted to return. She had just completed those mystery books, and she was excited to get the next books in her series that she so loved. She was an avid reader. Typically, and this is a heartbreaking fact, she would typically bike into town. She lived in Bristol Township, just bordering Bristol Borough, about a mile from the center of town, and she would typically bike into town with her best friend who lived in her neighborhood, who was 2.5 years older. So a much significant age difference in that she was a 7th grader, an older child, and they were always together biking into the library as soon as their books were done. On this particular day, her friend was not going to the library with Carol Ann. Rather, Carol Ann was meeting 2 other friends at the library. We actually know with such clarity her path of travel that she got on her bike, a bike that we know she loved, her racing bike, her Londonier racing bike, and she biked past Jerome's Market, was seen by the owner of Jerome's, and then went into Tommy's Cafe, and again, a heartbreaking fact that she got a Coke and penny candy. I mean, could there be anything more innocent? Returning her library books, getting a Coke and penny candy. And she continued down Farragut, turning down Lincoln Avenue. And for those of you that know Bristol Borough, we know that Lincoln Avenue runs adjacent to St. Mark's Catholic Church, where it meets Radcliffe. Unbeknownst to Carol Ann, and unbeknownst to everyone in Bristol Borough, living on Lincoln Avenue was an absolute predator. And a predator who his prey was little girls. And that is William Schrader. William Schrader was a man residing on Lincoln Avenue, just a block and a half from St. Mark's, less than a 5-minute walk from the church. And I'm going to go into his history. And forgive me, his history is going to be very difficult to hear. William Schrader was someone who was a transplant to Bucks County. He grew up in Luzerne County. And thanks to the investigative work done by this team, we know by age 8, he was a boy who was violently assaulting and targeting little girls. He would literally club little girls in the face, and it resulted in him being placed in a reform school. His behavior was so bad in the reform school that he spent the entirety of his youth in and out of reform school in his home county. Ultimately, at the age of 17, just before his 18th birthday, he enlisted into the Army. He was dishonorably discharged a year later. We know that upon his discharge, he committed an attempted murder where he attempted to shoot another man. Thankfully, that man survived. But we know that William Schrader's behavior was so violent while incarcerated pending prosecution for that case that the recommendation was a state sentence to be imposed. And of course, that state sentence was in fact imposed, and he served his time at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. We know then he is released from incarceration after serving his time, and he establishes roots in Bristol Borough, where his brother Frank and his sister-in-law Carol Ann were residing with their family on Lincoln Avenue. We also know that he was at times staying at the Bristol House, which is a kind of house for transients, closer to the center of town, closer to the wharf, I should say. We know that William Schrader's history of sexually violating little girls, it's the likes I have never seen as a career child abuse prosecutor. We know that William Schrader spent the entirety of his 62 years, from 8 at least to 62, violating little girls in ways that are unimaginable. And I'm going to jump around a bit, but it's important to know his history to understand the facts of this crime. William Schrader was not initially a target of this investigation. In the first few days and hours and weeks that followed the murder of Carol Ann, there were other suspects identified. So William Schrader managed to get away with murdering Carol Ann, and actually initially stayed in the Bristol borough area. But it wasn't until January of '63, so about 2.5 months later, that a concerned citizen saw something suspicious, something he believed was relevant to the murder of Carol Ann, which was unsolved still, clearly. And he reported this stranger cutting through his backyard, acting suspicious. And that was the first time we know William Schrader was on the police radar. And at that point in time, they did something critical. They interviewed him. Of course, he lied about his whereabouts, claiming to have worked on the day that Carol Ann was murdered, which we know, in fact, he was not at work. He was not at work for 3 straight days. But he also was asked to provide a pubic hair sample. 141 pubic hair samples were collected and tested in this case throughout the decades, and I'll get to that. Unfortunately, we were not fortunate enough to get a DNA extraction, but still, we had credible forensic evidence as it relates to the pubic hairs that were collected. And the reason why police collected pubic hairs, another heartbreaking detail, is we know that when Carol Ann was raped, her clothes were removed from her lower portion of her body. She was naked from the waist down, her shirt and undershirt pushed up. We believe a sock was stuffed in her mouth to keep her from screaming, and we know that she had clutched in her hand pubic hairs, and on her thigh, a pubic hair from the perpetrator that committed this unthinkable crime. So I commend the efforts from 1962 through last week. We know that microscopic hair comparison was not advanced in 1962. It later became a technique that was more sophisticated and more reliable. And I'll get into the specifics, but in short, out of the 141 pubic hairs analyzed from 141 different sources, only one person could not be eliminated as a contributor. And that's the standard that the forensic scientists with the Pennsylvania State Police Lab used. That's the highest standard in that type of analysis. Cannot be eliminated. And that was William Schrader's pubic hair sample. But independent of that, developed throughout the years were eyewitnesses that put him outside of the church. 20 years later, a friend came forward indicating that he knows there's information he has that he failed to share, and this friend lost his own daughter, and he finally came forward and told the Bristol Borough Police Department that he saw William Schrader outside of the church right before Carol Ann would have been murdered. Independent of the neighbor, Daniel DiMidio, who was the original source to put William Schrader on the radar of the police, and independent of the lab experts looking at the pubic hair samples that were collected throughout the decades. But what we can tell you next is, again, the part that's going to be hard to hear. We know that when William Schrader in January of '63 finally realized he was a suspect, he immediately fled the area. He had no ties to the South, but he fled to Florida, where he almost immediately engaged in criminal activity in Florida, then fled Florida to Texas, where again he engaged in violent and disruptive criminal activity in in Texas, and then ultimately found himself in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, where he established roots. We know while there, he married a woman by the name of Audrey Schrader. He met Audrey through her adult son, who was only a few years younger than William, who was a fellow inmate in a county correctional facility in Terrebonne Parish. When William Schrader married Audrey, almost immediately, he began to rape her 2 special needs daughters, one who was a young adult and one who was a minor, clearly suffering from a cognitive impairment that would prevent both of them from being able to consent, and this man also was their stepfather. We know when he raped his one stepdaughter, she conceived a child, and that child was a little girl, the biological child of William Schrader. And when that little girl, his step-granddaughter and biological child, reached the age of 8, she too became a victim of his sexual abuse, ongoing for years. It didn't just stop with his own stepchildren and granddaughter, or step-granddaughter and biological child. He sexually abused the next generation of children in his family. Individuals who had the courage to come forward and interview our detectives in this case and confide in their deepest, darkest secrets, things that they were ashamed of. In addition to that, though, perhaps the most troubling fact that we learned was that William Schrader and Audrey Schrader first were fostering a 2-year-old little girl in their home. Not a biological relative, but ultimately Audrey Schrader adopts this child. But they were also allowing a 12-year-old neighbor to reside in their home. And that 12-year-old neighbor was a little girl by the name of Catherine Smith. It was known that William was sneaking into the bedroom where Catherine resided temporarily in their home with the 2-year-old child. So Catherine was told to lock the bedroom door at night so she couldn't be victimized. On Halloween of all dates, 1970, William Schrader and his wife Audrey Schrader get into a violent domestic dispute where he assaults Audrey, his wife. Her adult son, Tommy LeBlanc, confronts his stepfather and throws him out of the house. What William Schrader does and says next is unimaginable. He gets his belongings and he says, "I'm coming back and I'm going to burn the house down and kill all of the bitches inside it." And we know that night there's an intentional fire set at the Schrader home, and we know the adults were able to get out of that home, but the 2 little girls in that bedroom where the door was locked at night to prevent them from being victimized, Catherine from being victimized by William Schrader, could not get out because of that locked door. And we know that Catherine Smith ended up dying in the fire. The 12-year-old child that we believe he was victimizing died. And perhaps just another heartbreaking but remarkable fact is it's believed that Catherine Smith put her body on top of 2-year-old, I won't name her name, but a 2-year-old child. And as a result, that 2-year-old little girl survived that fire. But you can't even imagine, and probably again something so heartbreaking for all of us, is that 2-year-old little girl grows up to be old enough just to be victimized again by William Schrader. So the generational sexual abuse that this man inflicted upon every female, child, and woman in his life, he didn't stop until the day he died. And he died at age 62 in 2002. One of the things, though, we know is that, one, his family came forward and provided truthful information about the murder of Catherine Smith, and ultimately, years later, he was arrested and prosecuted. He was convicted of manslaughter and arson, but nonetheless, he served state time. All the while, Bucks County law enforcement was still keeping Carol Ann's case alive. We know that William Schrader also confided in a family member, and that family member, Robert LeBlanc, another stepson, came forward to law enforcement in Louisiana, confiding in a member he trusted, saying his stepfather, William Schrader, admitted to raping and murdering a little girl in a Catholic church in Pennsylvania, in the town that he lived before he fled to the South. Unfortunately, that information did not make its way to the current team of investigators until many years later, but once they learned about this confession, Robert LeBlanc was still very much alive and still very much living in the home where the conversation was had. At least on 2 separate occasions, William Schrader admitted to him that he had done this and got away with it, and they interviewed him. And he was consistent, and what he said was that William Schrader committed this crime in a Catholic church, as mentioned, and killed the little girl because he feared she would reveal what he had done. So he had to kill her, and that's why he fled the area. So we secured that statement, that confession. And again, to be mindful, that confession occurred independent of the eyewitness Domidio, independent of the eyewitness friend who put him outside the church, independent of the forensic analysis of the pubic hair, and ultimately, and I'm just scratching the surface of the investigation, we were able to put this case into the grand jury. And we could not stop without adding an expert who's renowned in child sexual victim behavior, but also the assessment and classification of sexual offenders, Dr. Veronique Valliere, and you'll hear briefly from her. And she educated all of us and the jury on character traits from individuals that commit heinous crimes like this, the likes we rarely see. And one of the quotes I just want to share, and she'll certainly say more, and she's brilliant. She said, "For sex offenders who have violence as a character trait, which is a subset of offenders that is rare, their need to gratify their desires outweighs everything else. They see the world as a place to exploit, Such a worldview facilitates violence. And of course, the likes we rarely see, like this rape and murder of Carol Ann, and she'll speak more to that. But then, most importantly, this woman, Kay Talanka, Carol Ann's sister, we couldn't tell her that we believed we solved the case and that we're in the grand jury with the evidence we believe that paints a clear picture. And so she had blind trust in us, and she came in and testified, and she shared her personal account. And one of the things I'll never forget for as long as I live is that she wasn't even 3, but put in that car with her mom and dad who drove to the church to look for her sister, and she remembers her dad coming out and making noises that didn't sound human, keening and moaning and grieving, and pleading with his wife, do not go into that church. Don't see our daughter like that. And she remembers it and described it clearly for our jurors and for the rest of us. And she just also described the profound impact it defined the rest of her life and her family's lives, quite frankly, and still does to this day. And I commend her because she came in and showed such courage. And without that courage, I don't know that we would have been able to explain to the court, which was so important. They allowed us to use this proceeding, which is an arm of the court, the grand jury. And there's a reason, there's a function it has to serve. Beyond just finding the truth, to release it to the public, it has to be understood that this impact is so great. And who could have a greater impact than to Carol Ann's family? But also to the community. This defined our community. It's one of the worst cases this region has ever seen, perhaps maybe even country has ever seen. And Kay did that so bravely. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking because, quite frankly, it's not about me, it's not about us, those that helped get this case to where it needs to be. It's truly about Kay and her family. I am going to briefly turn it over to Captain Kelly from the Pennsylvania State Police, and then Chief Moores, Dr. Valier, and then we're going to conclude with Kay. Okay? And we'll answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, DA Schorn. Good afternoon. I'm Captain Seth Kelly, Pennsylvania State Police, Commanding Officer, Troop M. The Pennsylvania State Police, like DA said, closure of this investigation of 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty, who was murdered in October of 1962 in Bristol Borough, Bucks County. Carol Ann Dougherty was murdered at an early age, and the Troop M Criminal Investigation Unit never stopped investigating leads into her homicide. Although today's announcement will never change what occurred on that horrific day, we want to let her sister, Kay, and other family members know that this investigation has always remained a priority with the Pennsylvania State Police. We hope this outcome brings some closure and comfort to the Dougherty family. I would like to thank the Bucks County District Attorney, Jennifer Schorn, and her office, the Bucks County detectives for their continued support and assistance with this investigation. Also, I'd like to thank the diligent efforts of those troopers in Troop M's Criminal Investigation Unit, specifically Trooper Jordan Rhodes, Trooper Christopher Cleveland, and Trooper David Bear, who picked up the torch to see this investigation through. I'd like to also thank all the retired members of the Pennsylvania State Police who investigated countless leads over the years and never stopped searching for Carol Ann Dougherty's murderer. The Pennsylvania State Police will never stop its mission to bring justice to the victims of crimes. The members who did the primary investigation on the case are here, and if you have any questions at the end, I'd be more than happy to answer them for you. Thank you, DA Schorn.
Good afternoon. Chief Joe Morse from the Bristol Borough Police Department. On behalf of the Bristol Borough Police Department and the entire Bristol Borough community, I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to District Attorney Jen Schorn, the command staff of the Pennsylvania State Police, and their dedicated team of investigators for their exceptional work, bringing closure to this long-standing cold case. Their unwavering commitment to justice, tireless pursuit of the truth, and exemplary teamwork have finally delivered the answers that Carol Ann's family and our community of Bristol Borough have waited for over many years. We especially want to thank District Attorney Jen Schorn for her steadfast leadership and her continued support of law enforcement's efforts here in Bucks County. This achievement is a powerful reminder that justice may be delayed, but with determination and collaboration, it is never denied. Excuse me. Finally, this case has haunted the Bristol Borough community for decades. Many law enforcement officers, police chiefs, and seasoned detectives have come and gone over these years. Today, as the Chief of Police of Bristol Borough, I cannot tell you how honored and proud I am to stand here with Carol Ann's family, DA Schorn, Commander Kelly, their team of investigators, as they bring closure to this decades-old case. Thank you all for your hard work, dedication that brought us here today. Thank you all.
Dr. Valliere?
Good afternoon. I became involved with this case after DA Schorn. I had the privilege of being requested to examine independently all the amazing investigative work of the team behind me to assemble the information under the umbrella of forensic psychology and my work with offenders over the past 30 years, and was able to just examine the pathways of violence, characteristics of the offense, and see which suspect out of the ones presented these facts comported with, and then provided some education to the jury about offenders in general and what an outlier of a case this was, with the murder and the violence and the public display. Sex offending of children is generally a secretive crime that involves grooming and seduction and manipulation. And this was such a heinous, egregious crime that couldn't be solved. And I just presented to the grand jury my analysis of the case and the potential suspects involved in hopefully a way they obviously understood and felt it comported with William Schrader as a suspect. So it was a great privilege to work with this great team and be a part of such a wonderful thing.
Thank you, Dr. Valliere. Thank you
Thanks.
very much. And then finally, Kay and her daughter Jen are going to approach the podium.
Good afternoon. My name is Kay Dougherty, and I am the sister of Carol Ann Dougherty. On October 22nd, 1962, my sister, just 9 years old, was brutally raped and murdered. She was found by our father in the choir loft of our church. That single devastating act changed my family's life forever. For exactly 63 years and one day, this case was unsolved. Our family lived without answers, and the uncertainty surrounding Carol's death became a part of who we were, a shadow that touched every day of our lives. My parents both passed away without knowing on this earth who murdered their daughter. This week, I learned that the Bucks County grand jury determined that William Schrader was responsible for my sister's death. After so many decades of unknowing, this finding finally brings closure and a truth to a wound that never heals. I'm going to take just a moment to remember Chief Vincent Farragalli, the Chief of Bristol Borough Police, at the time of Carol's murder. He kept a framed picture of my sister on his desk throughout his career and in his home until the time of his death, as a constant reminder of this unsolved case and a promise he made to seek justice for her. His dedication symbolizes the compassion and determination of so many in law enforcement who refused to let Carol Ann be forgotten. In 1992, the 30th anniversary of her death, the Bucks County Courier-Times journalist J.D. Mullane published a 7-day series honoring Carol Ann's memory and revisiting the case. In 2024, journalist Mike Missinelli, nephew of Vince Faragalli, the chief of police at the time, produced a series of 14-episode podcast called The Coldest Murder, bringing the attention to more recent initiatives in solving the case. These two men ensured that Carol's story would remain in the hearts of this community. Their persistence and commitment to uncovering the truth played a vital role in keeping hope alive for all these years. Today, as Carol's only surviving immediate family member, I stand before you with profound sorrow, but with such gratitude and I sorrow for all that was taken away from my family, the gratitude for the extraordinary efforts of those who never gave up. I want to thank law enforcement officers, investigators, and members of the press like JD and Mike Missinelli for their tireless work. Because of them, my family finally has the truth that we have sought for 6 decades. JD, you've repeatedly told me as long as you were at the paper and you had resources, you will continue on this journey. But I believe even without resources, your voice would have prevailed. You once told me that journalism is your job. And that if Carol Ann's murder were to be solved, you could retire having accomplished a career. Congratulations on that accomplishment. And Mike, I can't wait to hear episode 15. Though nothing can bring Carol back, we can finally let her rest in peace, knowing that her story has been told, her truth revealed, and her memory honored. I feel like I kind of did a little skipping through with, I would have had a list of how many names, but this team behind me, God bless them one and all. They did something I never thought would happen. Thank you all for coming.
We're happy to answer any questions you may have. Just let us know whose question.
Jen, when did the confession from Schrader to his stepson take place, and how long of a gap was it between when he made that confession and you became aware of it?
There were 2 separate times that we know that Robert LeBlanc confided in a local member of law enforcement in his home county, where he was in and out of jail and under supervision. It's not clear. It seems perhaps that the first statement, which was in 1994, he may not have been ready to speak to Bucks County investigators. We know at the time William Schrader was alive, but we know after William Schrader's death, William Schrader passed away in 2002, we know that 5 years after his death, Robert LeBlanc came forward emphatically and provided that statement. I can't speak to why, and I have to credit my predecessors in the district attorney's office who committed resources throughout the years as well. I can't speak to why it wasn't available to everyone to consider and review. But I can say the scope of this case, the investigative reports, I mean, without Chief Joe Moores bringing evidence to us and everything he had in Bristol Borough, and without the state police doing the same, and without us pulling from our archives the physical boxes of files and thousands of pages of reports so they could be consolidated into for one team to review, we would not have known. And incidentally, the scope of that confession wasn't even known until this team flew down to Louisiana to interview Robert LeBlanc. So I'm sure the report will answer your questions in more detail, but at this juncture, that's the best I can do to explain it. Sometimes it just takes timing and the right team and the right set of circumstances to understand and be able to assess the credibility of this statement and put it in context with everything else we were learning.
And when, just not to put too fine a point on it, when did that flight or trip down to Louisiana?
That was only this within the past year. And we committed resources, and it wasn't just to interview Robert LeBlanc, it was to interview every family member that described the generational sexual abuse in heartbreaking detail, and some who never shared with their own adult children. So you can imagine the courage that took for William Schrader's family members to do that.
Jen, well, maybe this is for Tim or for Jordan. Where do you think the original investigators went off track with Schrader, that he was able to slip through the raindrops, so to speak, for all these years?
I don't want to cast any dispersions on the previous investigators. I'll say from a Pennsylvania State Police perspective, we only had a portion of the case file for many years. It wasn't until coordinating with the district attorney's office that we were able to get the full scope of the file. So I can say only from our perspective that we didn't have the confession for a long time.
And JD, I might be able to elaborate a little bit. When I say this, it's like the extraordinary set of facts that no matter how solid of an investigation was conducted, it was the perfect storm in that there were 3 separate individuals, all with varying degrees of sexual deviance, either identified as having direct ties to St. Mark's, the Bristol Borough community, and or being incorrectly suggested or implicated in this crime through no fault of law enforcement. So as you can imagine, and in this case, I think you know this better than probably most, that there was initially an individual who was of very low IQ, who was known as a town drunk, and who English was not his first language. He ultimately was suspected and gave, after hours of interrogation, a false confession. Within 24 hours of that false confession, thankfully, the investigators that had the bird's eye view of the confession recognized it was not credible, but that thwarted efforts. 24 hours after her murder, and that means William Schrader had 24 hours to get away, dispose of evidence, and lay low. And we know and we actually have eyewitnesses that we believe saw him that night, describing a man with a unique scar that goes high up on his cheek, looking like he had just literally murdered someone before they even knew a murder occurred. And they describe his character, his physical characteristics with such specificity that we believe these 2 women saw William Schrader. Unfortunately, their tip wasn't taken as seriously because, again, there was already a suspect in custody. And then from that, you had Father Sabatish, who lied about his whereabouts because we know he was a priest at the parish who was, we know now, conducting an affair or pursuing a married woman and buying lingerie in a shop in Humeville, so he was not inclined to tell the truth about where he was, so he lied to cover up because it would not be consistent with his vow of celibacy. And of course, there were subsequent facts, as I'm sure you know, Mike, that continued to keep Father Sabatish in, under a cloud of suspicion, but we know with certainty. And what was really unique about this, myself, Mr. Reese, as the prosecutors, but every single investigator that handled this case independently came to the same conclusion before we submitted this case to the grand jury, that they were satisfied with the alibis of the other suspects and that they were satisfied that the only remaining suspect was William Schrader. And that's before we pieced together all of the physical evidence and the statements. So the final individual was, unfortunately, a young victim of childhood sexual offense who was perpetrating sexual crimes against his own younger family members. More typical with Dr. Valliere's description of, what we see often in, the rarity being this impulsivity and recklessness and lack of self-control that we see in William Schrader's actions throughout his lifetime. But again, that person had no real ties to Bristol Borough, but unfortunately, his family believed he may be involved because they were seeing some sexual deviance in their own home, and there was a reach to suggest he may have had ties to Bristol Borough. So those 3 suspects thwarted the investigation and allowed for William Schrader to remain under the radar. And that is through no fault of law enforcement. It's just literally, I mean, of varying degrees, you had 3 individuals with some level of sexual deviance with ties to the community or implicated. So, but again, heavily vetted. That final individual I mentioned, without a doubt, was out of not only the county, but the state in Virginia, confirmed alibi. So extraordinary work done by our predecessors.
Jen, who was the witness that saw him in front of the church, or when did that witness come forward?
It's kind of one of those chilling things. Daniel DeMidio, he lived on Wood Street, so his home backed up to the cemetery that, as you know, Mike, was behind St. Mark's. And he saw someone cutting through, acting suspicious. Now, this was 2 months after Carol Ann's murder, but the actions of this individual who was a stranger to him were so strange and suspicious, he confronted him. He asked him his name. He said, no, I'm just a neighbor. I live up the street. My name's William Schrader, in an effort to encourage him not to call police. But his instincts were one of those things that they've seen throughout their careers, this amazing team of investigators, where, you know, words maybe can't describe why, but he felt this person was associated with the crime. And that report literally triggered everything, the flight, you know, the collection, thankfully, of the pubic hair, and the flight that ensued, and then, of course,
Maybe I misunderstood. I thought you said there was somebody else that saw.
oh, I misunderstood your question. There was a friend, Romero, Juan, but he went by Romero Ramirez. And he was a friend and an associate of William Schrader's. I misunderstood your question. 20 years later, after he loses his daughter, he comes forward. He is involved in a police contact, but he says, I need to share something, and he shares that he saw William Schrader out front of St. Mark's. One of the things that I didn't mention in my summary is we know that there was a woman parishioner who really wasn't super devout up until the 2 weeks prior to Carol Ann's murder. She was going to church every day, the same time in the afternoon. And as I'm sure you know, St. Mark's was always open to the public, and it was not locked. The doors were unlocked by 6 a.m. and weren't locked till the end of the night. And she tried to get in, and those doors were locked. And we know now with certainty, we can narrow down that time frame when Carol Ann was actually being raped and murdered. And we believe her little friends from the library that went to search for her were sitting outside those steps when the rape and murder were occurring.
Are there any other victims that can be linked to this aside from the numerous ones you've mentioned?
I only scratched the surface, too, on the ones I've mentioned, and we've obviously made it a point not to mention any of the surviving victims by name. But no, we believe William Schrader, I mean, this was done alone, and he got away with this, but just continued his life of sexual deviance and sexual and physical violence, the likes I said, we, and even Dr. Valier, who is just renowned in her area of expertise, the likes we rarely see.
And the booking photo, where does that come from?
That was, well, he committed a physical assault of an individual right out front of his brother's residence on Lincoln Avenue. So if you look at the time frame, he's released from Eastern State, and almost immediately, once he establishes roots in Bristol Borough, he's committing crime, violent crime. And so that was the booking photo from April. You can see April 24th of 1962. So as close as we can get. And you can note from this picture the very distinct scars that go up high onto his cheekbone on the right side of his face, which is consistent with what we believe those 2 women that saw him closer to the Bristol house with a bundle, describing him and clearly depicting someone consistent with William Schrader.
We heard a lot of details today, summary, and from the experts here. Can you just re-clarify one more time for us? What was that one piece that said now is the right time to push this forward, to bring all the resources together, or just clarify that?
You know, it wasn't just one right time or one right piece, excuse me. What it was we as an office have a relationship with a great genealogical lab, Othram, and Pennsylvania State Police have worked tirelessly using every resource they could to see if there was going to be a break in this case from a DNA perspective. And we have one of their experts, Corporal Chrisman here, and they were meeting and reviewing the evidence, meeting with my colleague Chris Reese to see if there were resources. We found resources to use Othram Labs. We were not successful. The evidence was so degraded that they were not able to extract a profile. But in doing so, it gets you hyper-focused on the case. So we as a team, and the troopers, 7 years, Trooper Rhodes, 7 years, Chris Cleveland, 4 years, Dave Bear, and then we were the later team from the District Attorney's Office, Lieutenant Perkins, myself and Christopher Reese. But now become hyper-focused on, wait, there are things that can be still done, and there are things perhaps maybe that wasn't fully considered or perhaps overlooked, but not faulting anyone for that. So it wasn't one thing. It was just timing and commitment. And that is not to suggest others weren't committed. I need to be clear on that.
I have a related question. You mentioned before that William Schrader was the only one who could not be eliminated from the testing of those pubic samples?
Yes.
At what point in the timeline did that happen?
That's interesting. It's a great question, because early on, there was the science was a visual comparison. And so they were able to exclude some people, like the first individual who I said had low IQ, kind of town drunk, English not his first language, because it was clearly distinguishable from a visual inspection. Science advanced, and then it became microscopic hair comparison. And the microscopic hair comparison, I believe, was fairly early on. I'm gonna consult with Trooper Cleveland. It was 93 that they were able to say with certainty. And I should state, 180 samples were collected. Of the 180 samples collected, 149 or 41 were sent to be analyzed. So they were able to eliminate some by, not credible suspects. 141, and 140 were excluded as the contributor of that pubic hair, and the only one that remained was William Schrader.
So a considerable amount of time went by, like you couldn't just rely on that alone.
No, you could not. It's certainly a very useful tool in forensic science, but of course the gold standard is DNA. But no one was collecting evidence for consideration of a possibility of development in forensic science like DNA in 1962, but it certainly wasn't through lack of effort to see if there was any possibility to extract DNA profiles, and we just weren't so fortunate. But actually, I credit that commitment, because that's what caused us to be hyper-focused on the case.
So were the other suspects mostly ruled out after 93?
They fairly, I would submit that they were ruled out with certainty. Well before then. The only one that remained potentially a suspect was Father Sabatish. And then it kind of resurfaced when there was a very similar rape and murder of a little girl, another little Catholic girl on her way to school in Hazleton, Maurice Chivarella. And there was a theory that Father Sabatish possibly had ties to the area, but certainly wasn't far from where William Schrader grew up too, but there was no connection. I credit the investigators. They were doing what they should do. Consider all similar type of very rare crimes involving the forcible rape and murder of a little girl from a sexual deviant and predator. But that was solved unequivocally by the state police through genealogy, and that person posthumously was identified as the perpetrator. So Father Sabatish may be resurfaced as a potential suspect, but we are absolutely, we were satisfied, independent of one another, that all of the other suspects, however, they were still very much considered again. Like no one was, we kept an open mind, but they were ruled out pretty early on.
And why invoke a grand jury in this instead of just investigating and issuing an announcement?
So it was important to us. The grand jury is literally a cross-section of the citizens of this county. They're randomly selected, not like your traditional jury where you can use peremptory challenges to strike jurors that you think might not be good for you on this case. They're randomly selected, don't know if they're coming in for 2 days of a service for a jury trial, a DUI trial, and instead are impaneled for up to 2 years pursuant to the Act. A report is rare. Obviously, you've seen them in the Archdiocese reports on the sexual abuse scandal. You've seen them in other similar type reports to affect change and to answer some longstanding questions that the community has. We were so fortunate that Judge McHugh and the Board of Judges allowed us to use the grand jury because we were satisfied, but it was so important for us to have our evidence validated by random citizens who heard the evidence and made a determination and voted, and quite frankly, at the end thanked us for being able to be part of something so important. So I cannot say enough about them, even though you'll never know who they are.
How long were they impaneled for the full 2 years?
The term is up to, standard term is 18 months with a permissible 6-month extension. So I can't speak to how long this one has been in service because it's part of the process, but We're one of a few jurisdictions that actively use our investigating grand jury, and it's been instrumental in helping us pursue the truth and justice in unsolved cases primarily. Any other questions?
Maybe if any of the investigators want to speak to what it's like dealing with evidence in a case this old?
Trooper Cleveland, you want to, or does anybody wish to? Okay, I think, but perhaps maybe after, if you have some individual questions, I don't fault them. If you want to pose something, I'll do my best, and if I have to consult, I'll consult. But
Jen, it's Troopers Bear, Cleveland, and Rhodes, and Detective Perkins were really the team that got this case solved.
And it was our privilege to get to work with them. And I can attest to the days, the hours, just that we witnessed, but I guess, and to say it again, close to 20 years combined of their lives, their professional lives, committed to this case, among many other cases. Okay? Any other questions? All right, thank you so much. Have a good day.